I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Cheryl Davies. After 2 decades as a scientist at Stanford University, Cheryl Davies relocated with her family to Western New York and became immersed in both the theory and practice of ecologic landscaping. Cheryl has a deep knowledge of native plants with a soft spot for sedges and landscaping with the natural conditions of a site. Her design work focuses on all things water, streams, riparian areas, wildlife ponds, mineral soils, rain gardens, and residential stormwater. She consults with homeowners and landscape professionals wishing to incorporate native plants into gardens of any style, identify and control invasive species, or foster play and discovery outdoors. She is designing a garden at Dream Island, home of the Williamsville Castle, that reflects the historic nature of the gardens using ecologic principles and native plants. With a competing passion for education, Cheryl has founded the Dream Island Initiative that aims to engage students in deeper learning and innovation through ecology. Without further ado, Cheryl, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. So let's bring up our slides here. So today is going to be a little bit of an eclectic talk. So those of you that are designers will try to incorporate some of the aspects of designing for, educational spaces, but not just educational spaces, also spaces, whether it's in a residential space in a backyard with parents who want a little bit of a different playground environment for their children, as well as, in parks and other settings where children, meaning anyone, under the age of 18, and certainly even beyond that, with the way that we interact with the world, can learn and develop skills in educational philosophy called deeper learning, which we'll go more into, and learning through ecology, the outdoor environment. I'm going to highlight a lot of education and activities on the campus of the Park School of Buffalo. I volunteer with the Park School, helping them with their, and have done some design and landscaping work there. So I'll be highlighting some of the work that I've done there, but also some of the work that the teachers are doing there in order to help kids in their experiential education. So when we talk about nature-based education, we want to expand it, and we're really expanding beyond the idea of just naturalist education or other field trips or ecology-based projects. So certainly nature-focused instruction is an aspect of it, right? But also, learning in outdoor classrooms, which I think more and more people have now experienced. Outdoor, just spending time outdoors, and I call it quietude, but studying or writing, or just meditating, as well as child-directed play and exploration. And it's really important to remember that children learn through play, and they learn best through play. And so their exploration of the outside truly is an education activity. Okay, so across the age groups, the Park School and the things that we'll be highlighting today go from pre-K to grade 12. So the education activities that we're engaged in really span. So in early childhood, most of learning is through play. And that play is helping to develop not only our understanding of the world and the connections around us, but also to develop gross motor skills, fine motor skills, and it's driven through a curiosity and discovery. Now, certainly as we move on, we keep those aspects. We're still playing, there's still a lot of development, and we're driven by the curiosity and discovery. And we start to incorporate more social development. We start to make more connections with the world and to understand different perspectives of not only the people around us, but perhaps also the animals and the plants and the world around us. We're starting to build that academic foundation of our core subjects, and starting to incorporate critical thinking into our understanding of the world. And in adolescence, right, this is where our developmental tasks move more into individuation, right? So this is where we're, if anyone's had teenagers, I've had 3, that this is where they're, coming into their own. They're figuring out who they are. They're doing that with their own peer group, and also starting to expand out into the community and the world around them, having more independence. They're now capable and of solving complex problems and applying all that foundation, that academic foundation that they had, and applying it. So nature-based education has actually been shown to have a lot of benefits. And so in scientific studies, comparing nature-based education to other forms of education, we find, improved cognition, health, the mindset that helps us to learn, things like resiliency, and our social behavior, pro-social behaviors. And we don't know exactly, the mechanism of all these improvements, but we can assume that some of it is from the natural kind of relaxation that people and stress relief that people find in the outdoor setting, as well as increased interest. So, kids are more interested in the outdoor. There's a lot of variety, right? And the decrease in anxiety that occurs. We certainly see a decrease, for instance, in ADHD symptoms, and maybe for people without ADHD, also increase attention, and that can really help as well. Okay, so what is deeper learning? So just to kind of understand what this is. This is a term that really kind of comes out of the education philosophy. It used to be called progressive education, the Dewey philosophy of education. There's lots of different terms for this, but what we're looking at is taking away from, remember all those, core subjects, the reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? We're kind of moving away from that being the only outcome. Certainly those are tools, and that's academic foundation that we need to master, and when we're mastering our core knowledge. But we are also learning some what we call transferable skills. And those transferable skills are really essential in adulthood, and for us to be able to innovate and learn, and to innovate and to solve complex problems. What this does is it taps into the natural curiosity of kids, and really into their own kind of natural methods of discovery. What we learn is that through experiential education, or doing things, right, that we can tackle novel problems. We can then develop our critical thinking, our problem-solving skills. When we're tackling complex problems, we have to communicate, right? So we learn to communicate effectively, and we learn to enjoy the process of learning, and enjoy the process of becoming more skilled. So what's interesting, though, is that there's really been a convergence in many different efforts, and one such effort is UNESCO's sustainability goals. And what they were looking at, what do we need children to learn and education world to produce in order for us to solve and build a sustainable world. Okay, so what they did is they, developed these criteria for education outcomes. That includes self-awareness, collaboration, integrated problem solving. And as you can see, it really maps on into a lot of the deeper learning criteria as well. So to simplify things, we're going to be looking at designing the outdoor space through these 4 essential skills. And that is learning how to observe the world. When we observe changes and relationships, successes or failures, we gain more insight into the problems that are out there and understanding the true needs, which is the next skill, right? So then we can apply and we can start to take perspectives and understand the needs of not just people, but also the world around us. Systems thinking is a very important skill to learn, and that's really understanding complex systems. So these are systems that are so complex, they produce what we call wicked problems, or problems that are very difficult to solve without changing something else in the system. Okay, and so understanding how to solve problems within a system and to reason with uncertainty and complexity is extraordinarily important. And then finally, innovation and creative problem solving. Okay, so why is nature and the natural setting particularly useful for this? Well, it's because of the complexity of the natural world, combined with the fact that humans have just evolved in this world. So children are evolved to learn through the outdoor setting and the world around them, much more than they've been evolved to learn, at desks on worksheets, right? There are infinite possibilities out there. One of the things that contributes to that infinite possibilities is the seasonality and the variety that's out there. So we all notice from season to season. Right now in Buffalo, we have snow on the ground, but you have the 4 seasons in places, and even places in California, we say that there were no seasons, but there were. We had the rainy season, we had the week that the leaves fell, and we had the sunshine season, right? And so you do have different changes, and you certainly see a pattern, and that pattern is with the seasonality is both predictable and surprising. And that allows us to learn from the environment around us, because those permutations from the predictable pattern creates a lot of opportunities for us to learn and to observe. There's just so much out there when it comes to sensory richness that is engaging for children and helps them to learn and develop. And then finally, it's really about understanding and feeling more connected to the world, and the benefits of feeling more connected to the world around them, and developing that mindset that they can make a difference. So just to kind of show you a little bit about deeper learning, I just want to highlight one particular project at the Park School. So in this case, so the Park School is an independent school, as I mentioned, that's based in the Dewey educational model. They have a 34-acre campus. It includes certainly athletic fields and a playground like you would normally see at a school, but also includes a natural area and a 3/4-acre pond and stream and a wetland. And so that provides a lot of opportunities. Now, a few years ago, one of the students, a senior, who had spent a lot of time, she'd been there from early childhood, and she'd spent a lot of time around this pond, and she noticed this little critter in the middle here. And she sent me a picture because she said, I think that this is an invasive crayfish, but I don't know. It just looks different. What she notices, it looked different to her. Now, it turns out that this is, in fact, it's the first sighting of an active population of this invasive red swamp crayfish, which some of you may know if you're from the South is a native species, but up here in the North, it actually creates a lot of problems. It outcompetes our native crayfish and creates a lot of problems with the destruction of our freshwater ecosystems. So what do we do? Well, so I connected the students with a Buffalo State ecologist that specializes in aquatic invasives. He came out and confirmed the ID and let us know that the solution to this is to drain the pond for a couple of years. And that's not going to work, right? It's a key part of the landscape there. It's an important part of the ecology in this suburban setting. It wasn't going to work. So our students went and learned, and they went to solve the problem. So they collected evidence from the scientific journals, from their experts, from other experiences around the nation. They developed and they implemented a trapping program. So that's this over here is one of the crayfish traps to monitor the population. They wrote and they won grants to bury a barrier. That's what these black rolls are here in the corner. They buried a barrier around to contain the crayfish. And they had to recruit and encourage people. And it was a tough process because some of that soil is old construction soil as well as rocky soil. It's unpleasant to dig in. They taught the 5th grade students. So our upper school students here went and they taught our 5th grade students about the crayfish and identifying them, and got them involved in the trapping and monitoring of the crayfish. And then they continued to research and understand, okay, now that we're at this point and we understand what we're looking at here, how can we actually start to reduce this population? So they looked all over the scientific literature. They looked for, clues. They looked at the system of how crayfish develop and multiply to come up with some ideas. And they decided to introduce largemouth bass into the system. And they're currently working on implementing that. And in order to do that, they also, again, applied for and received some grant money for that. So they're also, I'm also currently working with some students, and we're designing some floating wetlands for that will help to address any potential adverse effects of adding the bass. And they continue, they're so engaged that they continue to kind of pass down, right? So these are last year seniors that learned how to present. Okay, so for this process, what had to be available for them to do this? Well, they had to have a high quality habitat, certainly, right? That had, the crayfish available. But the students also had to have ready access to the water. And this student who initiated this had to be drawn to the water and spent time down there in order to even know that something was different, right? It's one thing when somebody introduces a project, but when projects are and problems are identified by students, then you know that learning is occurring. In order for them to identify the problems, they have to spend time around the habitats and nature. And then the students had to have an ability to modify the habitats. They could not, it could not be a landscape installation that's so precious we never want the kids to touch it. We need things that they can touch and dig and mess with, so that they can see what happens when you do that. And during this process, they developed all these skills, right? And these skills are transferable. They're not just for this or for a single course or for a single test. These skills transfer over their lifetime. Okay, so when we're thinking about designing these environments, really understanding how children interact with a world is essential. And I like to say it's a little bit like distracted mindfulness, right? Kids are living in the moment, but they're a bit like a dog when they live in the moment, in that if there's a squirrel over there, right, they'll, face right over and say squirrel, right? They notice things that adults don't, because their brains aren't perfect at filtering things out yet. So they are constantly noticing. They'll notice the little moth on the dandelion in the grass, right? And as adults, we often ignore those things. So that's an important aspect. So when things are at their eye level, they're going to notice interesting things. Kids also are really attuned to rhythms and circuits, and we can actually use circuits or so this bottom picture here is the Palo Alto Junior Museum old school edition. I think that they've since redesigned this, but when my children who are now adults were little, they loved these logs, and they would go around. It's a little spiral, and they would go around these logs over and over and over again, just in a circle, in a little circuit, right? And so we can use these sorts of things in our designs to bring kids into and close to those natural spaces. Children use all of their senses, right? So they will not only look, they will touch, they will feel. As I can tell you from my my youngest child, when they were on the Muni bus in San Francisco and decided to taste it, that they will even taste everything. And so we should expect kids to do that, right? Kids both engage in social play and gathering, especially as we move into adolescence, right? There's a lot of gathering and social aspects to being in the world. But they'll also use it to escape, either escape through their imagination and to escape under. So this is where we kind of learn about the different levels, right? They'll escape under the bridges or under the chairs, up into trees. Kids will push their limits. So as they interact with the world, they're going to push themselves right up to where they know they're competent and just past, right? This is actually a great skill for us to emulate as adults. They're constantly kind of pushing just to that next step. And that's how they're developing and learning if they're allowed to just kind of play. And they're experimenting both in their imaginative world, but also with the materials that are around them. So let's start looking at kind of the specific aspects here. So when we're looking at designing something that's going to help for physical development, we want to think like a kid, right? So kids are constantly wondering, can I climb that? Can I hang from it? Can I jump from it? Can I move around? Can I build with it? You can see up here, they're building with gigantic branches that have fallen off the trees. Can they move it around? What does it sound like? When these children are moving these leaves around, right? They're also, you'll sometimes hear them like start stomping on them because they hear the crunching of the leaves. They hear the rattling of the leaves against the rakes, and those things are also stimulating, right? They're engaging in ways that we may not think to engage, decorating the trees, climbing up on the chairs. So we can gain inspiration from the natural areas in the world when we're designing these spaces. And certainly, there's been kind of more of a marketplace for this is the playground in the lower school at Park School that uses black locust wood. This is a playground company that makes these play structures, right? And that can help it to blend in aesthetically with the world around them. We can also take inspiration from natural areas when we think about things like fallen logs or boulders. And these things can be put in a more legible setting, such as, the limestone boulders that have been chiseled. This was done by a local landscape architect from Rochester who developed this space outside the science building. Or it can be things that are naturally growing and maybe not so aesthetically pleasing, but absolutely wonderful for kids, like this old apple tree that must be, at least 80 years old or more. from an old apple orchard. Still producing apples, by the way. And this tree here brings up another really important thing, is that things have to be accessible to kids. They have to be at the height. When we are pruning trees, we should avoid pruning those branches so that the kids can't hang on them, right? So when we're thinking about other spaces, we're often thinking about keeping things up so people don't run into the trees, or keeping, the grasses outside of kid height. Kids actually will see things very differently, and we'll see that in a moment. And they're not so intimidated by having, tall grasses around them, or trees in their way. They find it as an opportunity. We also want to think about as much flexible use as we can. So for instance, in the seating areas here, right, and in other spaces, the kids can also climb up on them and jump on them. And they're not just a typical bench, right? They're things that can be used for other purposes in physical development. Okay, so as we're thinking about developing our creativity, we want to also think like a kid. So they're interacting with the world through imagination, right? They're noticing the variety in the world. They're thinking about where they can hide or where they can hang out together, and they're using their senses, right? So how do we design for that creativity and experimentation? The number one thing that we can do is to allow what we call loose parts, right? So you may have heard that if you've ever been in design settings for education, or for especially like early childhood education, the idea of loose parts. But loose parts include, the debris, the leaves, everything, the stones, the rocks, anything that a child can move and manipulate, even man-made things, right? But in this natural setting. So you can see here, in this corner, the kids really engaging and experimenting and looking at all the different things that they found on their treasure hunt. We want to allow the kids to also think about building with larger things, not just the small things. So when we think about some of the loose parts, some of that can really be bigger. In this case, they were building a bird watching shack with old wood, with our Park Schools partner, Earth Spirit. We want to really encourage things like straight species that can add to genetic variation. Over here, this lobelia here, this blue lobelia, is a natural variation that popped up in a garden that I was working on. Not at the school in this case, but in a garden that I was working on. Just popped up naturally, right? And fun coloration, right? And you could actually see this line going down where the wind had blown down seeds from some plant that ended up having a little bit more of the white in it. So there was just this little line of like the white among all the blue lobelia. We want to allow the natural decay. We want to not clean up at the end of the season. And we want to make sure that the kids have spaces that they can actually disturb. So they want to dig, and we should let them dig sometimes, and we should let them plant sometimes, and we should let them, cut, some of the shrubs sometimes. And that can be really hard when we are a little bit, type A about wanting, the landscape to look a certain way. And finally, because I'm in Buffalo, snow, right? We just got out of 4.5 feet of snow. It's supposed to start snowing again today. But snow is the ultimate loose part. So if you do have 4 seasons with snow, take advantage of designing with the snow as well. The kids at Park School, when they're in the lower school, their school list includes a sled. And that's because they can go out to the hillside. It's located on the escarpment, so they can go out on the hillside and sled down and build jumps and have all sorts of fun with that snow. Okay, so next is on our skill list is developing those observation skills. And I will argue that developing our observation skills is probably one of the most important skills that we can be working with kids to develop, and also one that's like disappearing the fastest as screens and constant on-demand streaming is there in front of kids and games. I think a lot of kids are losing, this ability to just observe the world around them. So when kids observe, they're observing at their level. So when they look at this panicum here in the middle, they're seeing this little grasshopper, right? Because they're on that level. And a lot of times when we think about designing for adults, we worry a lot about having really tall perennial borders that envelop adults, because it feels a little disconcerting. And certainly you don't want everything to be like that for a kid. But having some of those spaces is great for allowing them to observe and really see what's happening within the plants, because when they walk by it, they'll notice these things. We want the kids to have access with these things being close to buildings. So, and close to spaces. And we'll look at some spaces like that in a moment. We want places for the kids to sit and to write and to observe so they can really spend some time there. We want things that vary so that they notice the variation. This is actually up in this corner here is what's called the splash path. But this is just simply the stormwater drainage that drains the stormwater out to the forebay out to the pond in this case, right? And the kids use it in the rainy season, right, with all their raincoats and everything, and they're out there splashing and observing that water. And finally, encouraging storytelling. So if we have any teachers or educators on here, I think storytelling is one of the wonderful ways that kids engage with the world, and encouraging that. When my kids were in preschool, being nursery school on Stanford campus, the teachers would all have these pads of paper that they would carry around with them. And as the kids were interacting with the outside world and building, the teachers would start to ask them questions. And as the kids would start to engage imaginatively with their outside world, the teachers would actually write down for these preschool students that couldn't write the story that they were telling, which is a wonderful way to start to introduce the connection between the written word and communication and the experience that kids are experiencing. So this is a bioswale that we put in a couple years ago. So this is its second season here. This was previously beat up lawn. Usually had big chunks taken out of it from cars driving over it accidentally. There was no pathway. Water would actually pool near the walkways and just turn into big sheets of ice in the winter. So it caused some dangerous situation. Sheet runoff would cause erosion in a limestone dust path down to the pond. It was a problem. And so in this case, building a bioswale solves the rainwater problem. But the school didn't have the budget to build a huge, to come in and do something that was, would totally dig up everything and all of that. So we actually built this with volunteer labor, with our primarily with volunteer labor and a little help from a local landscaper. And so with this, we now have a garden of native species that the kids pass every day, because the kids actually move from building to building at this school. So over here in the lower school, they will walk over this path in order to get to the art classrooms, which are located behind this building for their specials or for music. So they're walking out, 4 seasons a year. So here we have different things, and we have different layers that and you may be familiar with the idea of designing in layers, right? We think about these vertical layers. So we have the ground cover here. This is wild strawberry. It's a wonderful ground cover because when the kids are walking by in the spring, they'll notice the little white flowers, and that gives them a clue that they should start to look for the wild berries. They see it weaving around the different plants. It's a really wonderful plant, in these settings. We have a lot of seasonal layers, right? So certainly the flowers that are in bloom vary from the bee balm, to later in the season, and so the kids can observe, the different bloom periods, as well as the different grasses and sedges that are under providing some of the ground cover layer. And there are weather layers, right? So when the sheet runoff comes, this fills all the way up and the kids can see and watch it drain down over the next 24 hours. And finally, we have multiple year layers because, many of these plants are pretty assertive plants that are in here, and they'll spread, right? So things will change from year to year. We also have I've also put in a lot of things in this that reseed, like the cardinal flower lobelia over here, and that will reseed, and those fill in spaces. So again, you can start to observe differences over the years. And because the kids are seeing this day after day after day, year after year after year, right, it gives them the opportunity to really engage in that setting. So here's another example of a project, if you will. So these lower school students were on a nature walk. This is just something that they do, get the kids out, they'll go on a nature walk and they'll go around the pond. And they spied a snapping turtle digging. It turns out the snapping turtle was a mama snapping turtle putting in her nest. And so with the school's partner, Earth Spirit, they're able to find the nest, and they protected it. So they marked it and they protected it from predation. And then they were able to keep watching and watching and watching and watching until months later they could see the turtles, and they actually caught them while the turtles were hatching. Some of the eggs didn't hatch. That's the one that and so they were able to examine those. They were able to examine the egg fragments from the ones that had hatched, the little babies, and how they were kind of moving around the world. And also, literally watch the new turtles coming out of their shells. So in order for this to happen, again, we have that high quality habitat, but we also have to have this incidental kind of discovery. And so it's really important that there are spaces that kids just aren't going to for a special project or a field trip, but they're spending time out there. Okay, observing the details is also incredibly important. And these go from the large form details, like the structure of a tree, to the small little textures and variety. And certainly we see these things in ecology. This student is engaging in the tree project, where they have to identify all the trees on campus. They're tagged, but they don't get to know what they are, and they have to figure out what all of them are. They start this in the fall, and if they're smart, they collect all their samples and actually start to look at it in the fall. But some of the kids delay, and they learn an important lesson about procrastination, because if you delay too long, the leaves go away. Now you have to identify all your deciduous trees without leaves, and it becomes much more difficult. In this picture here, these students are actually creating a field guide. So they're in an English class, but what they're doing is they're observing what they have outside and creating a field guide for the different species that they see. And they have to learn how to communicate, to observe and communicate what is about the plant, so that somebody else could use their description and identify a plant, right? This is art. We have an art teacher who's really fantastic about using the outside world, and they're making self-portraits using the different textures they had to observe all the different materials and the different textures and think about how they could use that in a self-portrait using natural materials. And then we have some really accomplished art students. This is an upper school art student who is really observing, aspects about the light that's out there. So if we want to stimulate interest here, that's going to draw students into these environments. So how are we going to draw them in and keep them interested? These students here are observing this crazy lady, that's me, taking care of some shoreline issues over here. But they are also looking at the waterfall that's around them. And water is I would say, is probably the number one thing that draws both the kids and the adults. And that also, creates the habitat for the animals and insects. Anything that's new and surprising engages kids. They love to build, and as they get older, they start to engage in engineering. Thus, building, for instance, the floating wetlands. These are students that aren't necessarily super engaged in the biology side of ecology, but they're very interested in engineering, and so we can include that process. Biomimicry has been really engaging for students, and I heard my own kids when they were in upper school talk about in higher calculus classes and things like that, how they are studying features of the natural world and biomimicry. And then finally, evolution, how things change. So when we're designing for water play, we want to encourage moving water, even if that moving is temporary, like through a hose or through a temporary channel, or through rainwater. But moving water allows kids to really play and manipulate and feel the flow of the water, as well as to manipulate the flow. So when we're talking about tools to manipulate the flow, that can be as easy as being able to move rocks around, and that's really important. We need kids to have easy access to the water and access in different places. So whether it's on the shoreline, to the moving water near the waterfall, but also the dock that goes further out into the little pond that's there. And that allows them to actually see things incidentally. And if you look under here, this is actually not at the school. This is in a different pond, but you can see the little green frog peeking out there. And those are the things that they start to observe. We want to be able to highlight the connectedness. Remember that systems thinking that we were talking about? Well, this is where it becomes really important. So this is a class that I was teaching on innovation and research, and as a volunteer teacher, and I was working with this is a college level class, and they were in the last portion of the class, they were given the problem of large algae blooms that were occurring, and they were asked to solve the problem. So as part of that, they developed this systems map. But what you'll notice here is that their systems map includes all the stakeholders. So they had to think about who's a stakeholder, but it's not just our typical, like, oh, there's plants and there's decomposers and, that sort of thing. They're also engaging the humans, because the humans are part of the system, and it's important for students to understand that. So they're using this environment and thinking about, how do the teachers, what do they value? How do the students value? And they're thinking about, the values, the actions, the impacts, and what people are taking in from each of the stakeholders, including some of our plant and animal stakeholders from their interaction with the system. And you'll have to ask questions if you want to know more about what they came up with there to solve that problem. Interdisciplinary learning is also really important, because it doesn't have to all be about ecology. So in this case, we use the outdoor spaces a lot. There's a lot of projectiles happening from a certain physics class, and they learn very quickly how to incorporate wind into their calculations, because otherwise the trees eat their projectiles. In this case, we have a student, using loose parts, if you will, but pine cones, and doing some math projects with that. Or even we have a lot of cross school interaction. So these are upper school students working with, I believe these are lower school students on learning about math and measurement. And in fact, they do a lot of cross-pollination, so they understand, how, concepts of growth and stuff that kids are learning in younger grades, interact with, for instance, calculus later. So creating a habitat, this is a student who is very engaged on the campus, and from her own initiative and her own work, got this school certified as a schoolyard habitat. We have all these, and it's working, right? Because we have all these animals that show up on the wildlife cam. That's the kind of grainy images there. But everything from birds of prey, which the kids end up seeing outside the window. So for instance, I was there a few weeks ago, and a large hawk came down, but with this gigantic bone. And the kids are observing this outside the window of their classroom. And so the teacher can stop and say, oh, look what's going on, right? And the kids can ask questions. So how does it fly with that gigantic bone? Well, it's a bird bone, right? That's how they can kind of think through, because why can it fly with a bird bone? What's different about bird bones? What makes it, why did it pull it over here? Did it hunt it? Did it scavenge it? Right. So all these different questions that teachers can engage with the kids, and the kids can, think about, because it is a high quality habitat. Now, to create that habitat, we need to have native plants, of course, but we also need other food sources. And so that, includes, providing for the insects, right? So our native plants that are providing for the insects, we need the water, we need places to hide, places to nest, and we need that interaction. This is the tricky part, is creating that habitat that's close enough so that the kids can see it in their everyday action, but also is far enough that there are places that the animals can go so that they are safe, and also teaching the children to observe, but don't touch without permission, right? I realize I say that and have a picture of somebody holding a baby toad there, but it is important for them to understand the safety in the environment. So this is our Montessori classroom. Kids were spying out the window, and the teachers were wondering what in the world that they were looking at, and say hello to our surprise visitor. This is the turkey, and the wild turkeys love the habitat there because they have access to water. They have access to mast species of trees. Those are things that produce food, like the dogwoods or the acorns that come from the oaks. And they like those. They like the water. They also like, there's a meadow that provides a grassy area with some of these short areas that they can scavenge in. Finally, deeper learning really allows kids to develop autonomy and responsibility. So they are pushing themselves. They're expanding their range, their zones, and they can have more freedom. In fact, in research, they've shown that kids have more freedom when they're in a natural setting. Adults tend to kind of step back a little bit more than they do perhaps in the classroom. They're given opportunities for the children to interact. So whether it's through campus cleanup days or special projects like the crayfish project that we discussed before. And they have to understand they're making decisions, right? They have to make decisions. For instance, what about the invasive species? What do they tackle, right? Because there's a big invasive species problem on campus, and they're not going to be able to solve everything. They're not going to be able to make everything perfect. They're not going to be able to pull out every weed. So how can they think through and problem solve and interact with those spaces? Edible plants are really great, and we think about raised beds. In this case, we did have a greenhouse because most of the school year is cold and outside of the growing season. But they can also be integrated into the landscape. So these are edibles that are on campus, right? And you can see all the different things that you may not think about. So the sumacs that are growing on campus, the maple syrup, pawpaw trees are one of my absolutely favorite landscaping trees for educational settings. They're so fun. They're crazy looking. They have a great story. ecology story associated with them, and a great story associated with the interaction with Native Americans. They have, and also how they survived with deer and in suburbia. They have these fun flowers that look like meat and smell like meat to attract the flies, and the fruits ripen at the beginning of the school year. So they're really great trees for this environment. Elderberries are also really great. They grow super fast, and so kids can cut them. They notice how fast they grow. The berries are fun. And we just teach the kids about, don't eat elderberries before they're cooked, right? And we teach them these things. And this is not my picture down here. This is not Park School. This is actually from the National Park Service and Friends of Acadia, but wild rice. So we just planted some last year, but there's a lot of learning that we can about native edible species when we're studying Native American populations as well, and traditions. And they also incorporate that as they're also learning about sharing economies and different economies out there. Non-vascular plants and fungus are really important as well. So they grow in the winter, and at least mosses do, and slime molds. We had a great project with slime molds at our calculus class. They got very into them and modeling slime mold movement. So you do have to make sure that you're providing the habitat. That means leaving the decaying wood, say shaded, moist areas without competition. Don't remove the moss, leave it there. And we do teach the safety with the fungus, right? And so, don't eat all the mushrooms, and understanding, when things are safe and dangerous. This tree, which is actually on a different property, fell about a couple days after this picture was taken, right? So you can leave some snags, but you do have to be safe. We talked a little bit about fillers here, and this is a fun, the different fillers that you can have that will seed in. And turtlehead is a little bit less of a filler, but it will kind of fill in there. But in moist spaces particularly, you can see how fun it is to watch the bumblebee go in and out of the turtlehead. You have, this is a great one. This is harebell or campanula. This is a native species throughout much of the northern US, and it seeds in really well. It's a beautiful flower it blooms throughout the year. And will kind of just spread where there's space for it. Building materials, so things that the kids can cut. So those fast growing shrubs are great. So the dogwoods and the willows, cattails are wonderful if you do have a wet space. If you have drier spaces, grasses are really wonderful for that. I love buttonbush. It is a little, it leaves out late and drops its leaves early. And so most of the action is in the summer, but they're still really tough plants that are great in these settings. We have our oaks and our black cherries as great habitat species supporting insects. But we also think about things like hawthorns, because or trees like that are a little faster growing, but they also have really impressive winter structure, and that's really fun for the kids to experience. And they have a lot of tulip trees on campus that just happen to be growing there, and the kids really like those. Pollinators, of course, we think about Asclepias. Here, the mountain mints, you can see how many, this is by far the best for observing pollinators, how many different types of pollinators that you get on the mountain mint. It's mind-boggling. You get really interesting wasps, all sorts of things. The mist flower here is a really wonderful, we had a picture of it earlier with the monarch on it, but it actually blooms right in the right season for kids to observe as they're coming back to school. At least here, that's when it blooms. And so it's a really great species to have on campuses, as well as asters that are blooming later. And then, of course, you need the spring interest. So spring ephemerals, when they're placed close to doors or places that kids can be, Jack in the Pulpit, May apples, those are, and shooting stars, these are all resistant to deer and critter munching, and they can be great surprises for the kids when they pop up. As well, I can't go throughout a presentation without mentioning carex, which is wonderful. We also use ferns a lot, and ferns are also very underused in landscaping settings. So we're running low on time. So I do want to note just a few quick things with stakeholders and the importance of really thinking about the perspective of the stakeholders. Remember back to our map of the pond system. It's sort of the same sort of thing when we're designing in this setting. You know, as the teachers are thinking about how they can use the space, the kids are wanting to explore, right? The administration is not wanting to have excessive costs or maintenance, right? And that's really important. And so we think about things like addressing those with incremental approaches to landscaping these spaces, using bounded spaces with natural boundaries for safety, and making sure that our planting plans and maintenance plans really take into account the fact that most educational settings have very skeleton maintenance crews. We'll skip this other setting, except for to say one of the ways that we dealt with some of the aesthetic issues is that we created these planters, which can be used for certain class projects. So this planter has, and it kind of keeps it bounded in. So the things that tended to look messy because you had these little like class projects all over in the garden beds, we can put in these planters. This has wheat in it from a class that was growing winter wheat. And so finally, when we're looking at maintenance, the real key here is to pick your battles. So leave things around. Don't spend your time cleaning up everything. Mow with the ecology. Don't over prune things. And really just pick your battles when it comes to the gnarliest invasives that are out there. If people have questions on safety, we can certainly talk about that. But it's pretty much the common sense that we've thought about. Okay, so I can take some questions if there are any here.
Yes, thank you so much. That was fascinating. There are a few questions in the chat. John asks, any ideas on how to balance all of this with reasonable fears of ticks and tick disease?
Yes, so ticks and tick disease. So first of all, we let our families know that we do have an outdoor space and they should dress their kids appropriately for that space. So during tick season, we do send out the school, I shouldn't say we, I don't work for the school, but they do send out a reminder to parents to dress their kids appropriately, and they monitor for ticks. You know, honestly, we don't have as big of a problem with ticks as you would think. And part of that is that we have an ecosystem. Right, so the ticks get eaten, and the things that are hosting the mice, they get eaten, and so we have lots of birds of prey, we have lots of snakes and things like that, and so we actually don't have a huge, but we have found them. Kids learn how to they learn how to do tick checks, right? And parents are just told up front, like, your kids are gonna, you know, they're gonna get some scrapes and cuts, and you know that's part of being a kid. But we watch and we make sure that we minimize those. And I don't think that they've had any serious tick bites. So
awesome. Do you have any suggestions for balancing freedom to cut and pull apart and or stomp on things with a respect for what might be living in the landscape and or impacts of too much disturbance? From Laura.
Sure. So this is there. So from a design perspective, right, you can create different boundaries that can allow, kind of encourage the interaction in spaces where it doesn't matter as much. So for instance, in that bioswale, right, I put in species there, as well as the path, that last kind of patio, I put in species that if the kids step on them, it's probably not going to faze them much. right? But we also make sure that we put in, because they're going to go path of least resistance. So we're thinking about, where are they likely to step and to run through. In part of when they put in the construction, they left out some steps that the landscape architect had originally wanted to put in. And I can tell you that they should have been there, right? Because the kids just walk right through the garden, right? They walk right through the meadow. And then part of it is also when you're teaching this way, because you're teaching about the interconnectedness of things, right? You can use those opportunities to teach about the impacts of what happens, because you're part of the system, what happens when you step in there. And they start teaching the kids that when they're very little. So the kids become very aware of what they're doing and the potential impacts on them. They help police each other.
Nice. Sylvia asks if you have any recommended texts for ecology for adults at the professional level.
Oh, wow. So I have to look up there are some freshwater ecology books. There are a lot of kind of standard textbooks, like the introductory textbooks. And sorry, I'd have to look up the authors for that. I don't, I think, from the perspective of a lay, individual who isn't as interested in all of the details and the terminology and things like that, there are some really wonderful books. And so certainly Doug Tallamy's books, kind of cover those sorts of things. But even, Growing in a Post-Wild World, some of those books that are out that are kind of more popular books, they're really covering a lot of those concepts that are really important. But I can follow up with a couple of ecology textbooks that are more kind of the introductory level, certainly.
Awesome. And then the last question that we have is kind of lengthy, but Lauren asks, any advice for how to get a public elementary school to create space for daily outdoor learning? I was thinking of suggesting activities like story time or easy art projects like drawing nature observations. The school has an on-site vegetable garden, but it's seasonal and kids only spend about 30 minutes in the garden once a week. And then a follow-up question was, do you know of any elementary public schools that have successfully implemented a forest school type class into the curriculum?
So public schools are tricky, and I will tell you, I've heard folks, that do this, that have lamented that it's probably that they feel like it's a lost cause. I don't think it's completely a lost cause. And there's two reasons for that. One of them is that deeper learning is becoming recognized more and more as a really important aspect and way educational philosophy, right? And so when our kids were in school in California, this was the way that the public schools ran, is with, and so they did incorporate outside. So they had that farm, and there's a few things that help. One of them is teacher education, and as much as teachers could be supported to be able to use those outside space. They often don't know all the different ways that they can engage in that outside space, or how it interacts with some of the other the subjects that they can be teaching. When teachers are on the hook for test scores, right, that's what they're going to be, often that's what they can be focusing on. So as much as you can kind of encourage and help to tie the outdoor space and the activities that you're doing in that outdoor space. So certainly the nature observations, but, tying that to some of the writing, core standards that they have can really help to be able to sell these things. And certainly promoting some of the information on the evidence surrounding the outdoor learning and the benefits of that. In California, they had a lot of trees and such also surrounding their farms, and pollinator gardens and things like that. But the key is that when you have a garden and they're only in there for 30 minutes, they're not getting that experience that they will if they're playing around there. So anytime you can move that landscape into those spaces, that helps. Having parents that are volunteering to help maintain the space also can be very useful. For instance, anything that you can do to take the burden off of the school.
Awesome. Yeah, I know there's a large debate in sustainable education whether or not it should be integrated or a separate thing altogether. And it really feels like with deeper learning, the integration aspect is much more impactful. I think we have time for one more question. Kate says, our grammar school principal is against putting in a pollinator garden because of the yellow jackets nesting on the property. We tried to educate her about the value of pollinators and the fact that many won't sting unless threatened, but there was no changing the opinion of the school administration. Any suggestions on how to move forward?
Yeah, this is really about education. So pollinator gardens don't attract yellow jackets. The school's lunch, the kids' lunches do. That's what's really attracting those things. So educating about all the different types. In fact, even bringing in, if you saw the video that I showed you from the mountain mint, right? You can actually see there are no yellow jackets there. There are a ton of other things that are there. So educating about kind of our native pollinators. I tell schools and parents that are worried about it that I spend all day with my hands in the middle of these plants, and I have never been stung. The only time I've been stung is when I walked headfirst, and that's my own problem, but I walked headfirst into a European hornet nest, and they rightfully chased me down. But they just don't. And so it's really just about kind of education and understanding that we're there. And the other thing to really kind of promote is that I was reading one study that suggested that there was a impact on fears. So a lot of kids have fears about their outdoor environment, about bees and about these things. And there is a sense of accomplishment when kids can face these things and develop and not only become more comfortable and less fearful, but also understanding their own process and how they can address their own kind of feelings of anxiety around these things and learn how to self-calm and soothe. And outdoor learning environments can be wonderful for doing that because they see real benefits to it.
That's awesome. All right. Well, it's just about 1:15. So thank you so much, Cheryl, for your time today and for giving us such a wonderful presentation on deeper learning through ecology. It was fascinating. If anyone has any questions on any future webinars, please feel free to email me at mads@ecolandscaping.org. And keep an eye out in your inboxes for a follow-up survey. Feedback is how we improve everything, so we look forward to all of your comments. Thank you again so much and have a great rest of your week.
Okay, thank you.